I just finished listening to a really interesting podcast. It's the podcast called How to Be Awesome at Your Job, which is such a great title. And in it, the interviewer in the podcast, Pete Mockaitis, was interviewing Dr. Amy Edmunson from Harvard Business School. If you're not familiar with her work on psychological safety, definitely recommend that whether you check out her TED Talks or read her book, The Fearless Organization. She's one of the real pioneers in the field. And I have to say that of all the skill sets that are required to be effective in the workplace, especially as a leader, I think knowing how to create psychological safety is one of, like, whether it's the top three or the number one skill set, because psychological safety is the experience of being able to be candid, open, vulnerable, authentic with somebody without fear of being mocked, ridiculed, harshly judged, retaliated against, etc. And there are a couple of points in the interview that I just wanted to highlight because I thought they were so important in this, related to this topic. So first off, in the beginning, when Pete asked Amy Edmunson to describe psychological safety or to define it, it was interesting that her definition has evolved over the years, where she said it's the permission to be candid. And I really like that because it, to me, and then she said more than just that. She sort of filled in some of the blanks. But one of the things that I think sometimes we can misunderstand or misinterpret the term psychological safety is believing it means if I'm psychologically safe, it means I'm comfortable bringing up a really difficult issue. And I think there are levels of comfort because by definition, a really difficult issue, it's not comfortable bringing up. And I think of the more psychological safety we have, the more willing we are to bring up a difficult issue because we don't feel like we're going to be mocked or judged or ridiculed, or if we are judged, it's done in a compassionate, non-emotionally charged way. Like there isn't an attack on who we are or our professionalism or our character. It's more our behavior is maybe is evaluated in context that's relevant. And so psychological safety, I think of it as sort of like a sliding scale. It's not a toggle on off kind of experience. And so it doesn't mean it's easy or comfortable. It means the threshold of what level of fear or anxiety we have to cross in being able to bring up an issue is much lower with somebody we feel safe with. So let me give you a specific example. So think of somebody that you feel very comfortable being vulnerable with. They're not like super judgy. They don't instantly give you advice on how you should think or feel or what you should do. And they're not they don't do this better than superior attitude. They certainly don't mock or ridicule or use it against you. And so let's say there's some flaw that you have or imperfection that you're not really super, proud of, comfortable with, but you need to talk about it. And that friend there, even though it's like, oh, I don't want to look at this or share this, because of how they are, the threshold is at, let's say, this level of like what you need to overcome in terms of reluctance and fear and anxiety to bring that out, versus somebody who is all those other things I talked about, like very, judgy, takes a superior attitude, loves to be better than, ask, sort of put you on the spot questions, whatever, that's a much higher threshold to cross, to like rise above in order to be willing to bring something up. And so, for example, let's say let's take it out of the personal realm. A supervisor, let's say, who tends to be a bit micromanaging. If there's somebody who's has demonstrated they're interested in your feedback, your opinion. They've shown that they care about their impact on you. They don't get defensive when you've brought up issues. The threshold is pretty low. And so if they're like, they're kind of getting a little micromanagey here, it's a low threshold for you to get up your courage, but it's, because it still takes courage because they're your boss. There's a lower level of courage threshold to cross in order to bring it up, versus, let's say, a different supervisor you've had where it's clear they don't like feedback. It's sort of my way or the highway. They have a kind of a short fuse, or maybe they get impatient pretty easily, or the few times you sort of broached a topic around, hey, it'd be much easier if you gave me more leeway or whatever, it was clear from their sharp retort that they weren't too thrilled with you speaking up. So with that person, that supervisor, it was a real high threshold of you had to be really courageous in order to bring it up. And maybe you thought you know what, it's just not worth it. So that's what I think of in terms of psychological safety with difficult issues, always difficult, hence the term, but different levels of willingness to go there based on how the person interacts. So that's one really important point to keep in mind. It doesn't mean if you create psychological safety with somebody or great psychological safety in a team that it's easy to talk about difficult stuff, but it's a whole lot easier. And the big point with psychological safety is if the bar is low, this is a good thing. If the bar is low in terms of how inviting people are for you to talk about difficult stuff, you don't have to wait until you've had it up to here to you know what, for the last year, it's been driving me crazy. Do you know how that's happened in situations where you don't want to say anything because you're afraid of how they'll respond until you've had it up to here, and then you're really aggressive or you blow your top. So with a team that doesn't have psychological safety and the bar is up here, the threshold, it's not until it's you know what? And then you let it rip. And now there's even more tension in the relationship. So by learning the skills of psychological safety and doing our own work in terms of being welcoming of feedback and practicing on being more skilled at having difficult conversations, it lowers the overall threshold. So that's one big point from that podcast interview. And the other point that was really interesting, I mean, a lot was interesting, but I thought was a very great, useful point, was when Pete described a scenario about 10 years ago where he was in a consulting project with a big retail store. And they were talking about something called, I think it's called size packets, if I remember correctly. And how when a clothing company, a designer sends product to a retail store, they have particular packets of different numbers of sizes for each item. So there might be 20 double XLs, 10 XLs, 7 Ls, 5 Ms, and 3 Ss, whatever, something like that. And so Pete, being new, not being like a seasoned veteran in the retail industry, he's applying his fresh eyes to this situation. And he's asking like, is that like kind of like, is that a thing? Like, why is that? Because he's thinking, I imagine he's thinking rightly so. Oh, actually, he did mention this in the interview. When they were discussing this, he's thinking like, this is a huge retail store. They should have the purchasing power to say, like, hey, we want this breakdown in the different sizes. Like, that kind of makes sense. They're the customer. And so when he asked like something like, is that really a thing? His colleague in the fellow consultant in the project goes, are you serious? And it was interesting because it's one of those little moments of truth in interactions where his colleague didn't mean like, are you an idiot? It didn't have he didn't have a tone of voice like that. He just wasn't sure like how he was supposed to respond to what Pete said. Like, if Pete's just joking, he doesn't want to like delve into some explanation when it's like, I'm kidding, dude, sort of thing. And Pete said like how instantly he got the message like, oops, that wasn't a smart thing to ask. Again, even though his colleague didn't have an attitude in his tone of voice. And what I loved about the interchange between Pete and Amy Edmunson is Pete said like I didn't say anything after that, and that was on me. And so they talked more about being aware of our responsibility when it comes to psychological safety, as sort of like being on the receiving end of somebody else's communication. It isn't just like everybody else should tiptoe around like we're fragile individuals and like don't ever say anything that might trigger us. It's this interesting, I don't even want to say balancing act. I want to use the metaphor of conversation because it's metaphorically and literally a conversation. It's a conversation between us being mindful of how we come across and the way I'm saying things. Does that invite people to share candidly and unguardedly? Does it invite people to share their different point of view, or does it send up like flashing warning sign, danger ahead? This person will cut you off at the knees if you say something. They will be sarcastic with you and say something humiliating in front of other people. Or do we send a welcoming mat that this person is open to a different point of view or disagreement? So it isn't just us being mindful of how we come across. It's also again, the conversation, it's give and take part of psychological safety. It's also, what's my part in this in terms of, stepping up to the plate and being willing to deal with my discomfort and acknowledging I don't know this thing about this whole size packet thing. And I was actually being serious, or I'm not really sure what people are saying in this meeting that seems to be self-evident to others, or bringing it up to a person like, I didn't really like it when you said that to me. Being willing to bring that up to a person. So another really important part of psychological safety is recognizing our part in it. And as the receiver and the one who maybe feels anxious or unsafe. And it also brings up two other issues that I want to loop into this. One was, I was talking with somebody about a program she was asking me if I did any sort of programs on dealing with difficult people. And I said, yes, I do. And she said something about, it's interesting because the way we label that, there's no such thing as difficult people. And I thought that was interesting because it made me think of um, uh, a couple of years ago, I did a workshop on having courageous conversations. And I shared with the audience about, I wrote a book called Dealing with the Difficult Coworker. And it was really neat because at the end, this very soft-spoken gentleman came up to me and he said something like, I think it was interesting, your title, because wouldn't it be more non-judgmental to, instead of call it how to deal with a difficult coworker, how to deal with a coworker who you find difficult? And I love that he said that. And I said to him, like, hey, love that. I think you're right on with that, because it's, the truth of it is that I find that person difficult or you find that person difficult, rather than labeling them. It just makes for an easier title to say difficult coworker. But again, I don't see the world in black and white, and sort of like when I said about psychological safety, there's a conversation between what is my responsibility as a communicator to be aware of in terms of what I'm saying, how I'm treating people, and then the flip side is, what is each of our responsibility as the receiver when we're having an emotional reaction to somebody? What's our responsibility about our reaction and whether we bring it up or not? So I'll get back to the difficult person theme in a second. And so if I'm saying, oh, that person is controlling or micromanaging, but I'm not willing to bring it up because I just say, oh, they're not psychologically safe to speak up to, I need to look at that. And how much of it is me unwilling to go over this threshold, and I need to be braver and do my work, and how much of it is me is like, the threshold is really high given how they relate, and I'm not willing to deal with the potential fallout given how they've acted in the past. So I'm going to choose not to bring it up. So again, it's not just black and white. It's a conversation. There's grays. And so the dealing with difficult people, I do think there's some people that are just flat out difficult for 99% of the population. And maybe there's like 1% that can relate to them and don't find that difficult. And then a lot of the people that we label as being difficult, that's something about their personality and our personality. So now I'm trying to remember why I kind of went off on that. But to wrap this up, I'm going to like pull myself back in from from this little monologue back to owning our part of it. So when Pete said, that's on me. So not just, oh, I know what it was. Two things I wanted to mention was not just externalizing that that person is uncomfortable to bring up an issue with, therefore I'm not going to say anything, owning our emotional state and our choices. It also reminded me of this rather confrontational comment on the very popular saying, at least in the United States, if I'm offended by that. And I think it's by a British, I don't know if he's a member of parliament or what. I didn't check that out, but I'm pretty sure I've seen his name, where this is a toned down version of it, where he said something about, in today's world, when you say I'm offended, it's sort of like, that's the other person's clue to say, I'm sorry, back down, take back what they say. And really, I'm offended is just a fancy form of whining. And then he goes, who gives a bleep that you're effective? Which I do not agree with. I think that's a little strong. But again, it goes back to sort of like this sliding scale or continuum of, back to bring it to psychological safety. It's each of our responsibility, I believe, to think about how we come across, and are we coming across in ways that foster psychological safety? And then the flip side, again, in closing, it's our responsibility to own our reaction, figure out how am I going to manage my emotional state and not require the other person to do something that manages my emotional state, like put my emotional state in their hands. And what's the conversation I need to have with that person? Or, and as speaking as somebody who's pretty sensitive to rudeness and lack of courtesy and meanness, et cetera. I do this a lot. So I'm speaking from experience, asking myself, what am I being asked to do here? You know, by the universe, if you will. Is the lesson I'm supposed to learn to, put on my big boy pants, suck it up, and have a difficult conversation with this person? Or is the lesson I'm here to learn from this to, like, here's an opportunity for me to work on emotional self-management and resolving my negative emotions about what they said, resolving this on my own. And when I say on my own, that could be talking with close friends that I respect, people who are like trusted advisors, could be journaling, it could be whatever, but not engaging that other person in the process of resolving whatever negative reaction that I had. So it's like maybe my lesson this time around with this person is work on learning to let go of my annoyance, anger, resentment without engaging the other person, and entering the next conversation in a peaceful state with full of goodwill, instead of, okay, the lesson is, here's another opportunity to practice having a courageous conversation. So I'm going to close up now. This is like way more than like the 10 minutes I planned on riffing about the excellent interchange. But I encourage you to watch or listen to the podcast. I said watch because oftentimes I watch podcasts. I don't know if there's a video version of this. Listen to the podcast, How to Be Awesome at Your Job, or again, listen to any of Amy Edmunson's talks or read her book, The Fearless Organization. So hopefully this is useful and thought-provoking.